it's a great pleasure with, to discuss this project, actually, where Aaron was also one of the participants of the data collection. So we feel very privileged also to feedback some of the results. The whole aim of this project was to think about where is pharma going in terms of research, in terms of production, in terms of new technologies, in terms of access, in terms of social policy around that. And this project was conducted in the fall of 2020, so in the middle of COVID, and that had some implications because we were not able to travel and there was very little room to connect. But that drove us in the direction of so-called digital tables. So we had small groups with participants from Europe, Middle East, Asia, US, Canada. So actually, we could include a lot of experts, and not only scientists, but also patients, NGOs. We also collected information from pharma activists, people who are very critical on the pharmaceutical industry and pharmaceutical research. So we tried to collect as much information as possible, and we used a certain methodology, and I will come back to that later on. The paper was published last year, and I hope you have a chance in the future to have a more deeper look into that. So my presentation is very much on the highlights and on the overarching concept. What you read here is the future of medicines and social policy, and you can say, well, that's just a title. But we had a lot of discussion within our team, and the team was including people from academia, but also from other groups, consultancy, people from pharma. And we started with pharmaceutical research, and as in the title, and then we had forward-backwards discussion, and then we came to the future of medicines as a more umbrella term, but also to include social policy, and you will see in a couple of slides why we included that title, because social policy is also an umbrella term, but it affects economics, geopolitical situation, also beliefs on should we invest in certain areas of drug development or not. So the title is not coincidence. There was a lot of thinking behind, in particular the combination between the future of medicines and social policy. And that is something that we really learned from this project, because all the people, or at least most of the people that were involved, are coming from science. So actually we went into the lab and thinking about what do we see, and will we see the same in 2030 or 2040? And during that process, we discovered, and we also found out, that it is not only the science or the lab stuff, but also the environment, and that will shape, for a large extent, also the future of the world we are working in and living in. So that is about the project itself a little bit. You have already heard this. A little bit about the background, where we started, because usually a scenario project starts with some kind of a taxonomy of what's out there, what's cooking, what's happening, and just a very brainstorming type of exercise where we try to collect as much information about, okay, this is out there, and that may affect also the future. And what you see here on this slide is of course not new to you. It's a summary. It's a summed collection of a number of important features we discovered, and maybe not discover is the right word, but we collected, and in particular the tensions between, in one side we have a narrative that is very positive, the first one. So the life sciences add to patient benefit, and it's a very appealing one. But also, it's not all good news. We have a lot of discussions in your country, in my country, even in very rich countries, you see a lot of discussions about are healthcare systems sustainable, rising cost, therapeutic gap. So there is a need out there, but there is no therapeutic option available. Drug shortages, of course. And this is, of course, not a complete list of possible problems, but it's not all good news. And there is an increased pressure from policymakers, but also social activists, investors, to rethink the pharma business model. We included also in some of the digital tables investors, and actually we were surprised to collect the same voice and concern from both investors and social activists. We usually thought, well, there are more opponents, but in some sense they say, well, we are very concerned about the sustainability, money that goes in and the products that come out, is that still in balance? And so this whole pharma business model thinking, rethinking, and just this morning I opened the daily newspaper in my country, and on the front page there is a big article: the government will not reimburse a new product for breast cancer. So a big political issue, a lot of discussion. And of course, in the back, there is this question of why should products so expensive, and what are the risks for the investors and the companies, but also at the end of the day, public health and patients that need these products. On top of that, we had a lot of discussion about what we coined as global divide in the development and access of essential medicines. It's an escalating concern. And you may remember, of course, the whole discussion about the access to COVID vaccines, where we saw not a very equal distribution across the globe, where some countries were very well served and other countries still struggling with having access. And that global divide is becoming nearer and nearer, also given the geopolitical tensions we see at the moment. I have to emphasize this project was done before the Ukraine war started. So since then, a lot of things have changed across the globe. So maybe when we would have done this project today, we would have maybe a different result or a different perspective. But this global divide and a lot of tensions on collaboration, on exchange of researchers, on students, etc., is something we thought that would be very important also to acknowledge. And then, of course, the future is driven by a wide array of both scientific, socioeconomic, medical need, and health policy and geopolitical factors. So this has an appetite of okay, this is the scenery we work in. And you see, this is more than science only. This is, because the science is driving pharma. And that's you, that's me. And we really feel that we feel that we are contributing it. But on top of that, we see that the world is bigger than only the scientific arena. When we go back to the methodology we applied, and there are a number of key steps in scenario analysis, a few points to highlight. First of all, scenario planning is about changing minds. So we have this conversation now, and we may have another conversation at another moment. And I don't want to change your plans, because that's your own responsibility. But think about how could the world look like in 2030 or 2040, and what does it mean, for instance, for my university, for my lab, for my patients, for the industry, for whatever interest you have. So it's not about forecast, it's about changing mental maps and take a long view, so that you are beyond your comfort zone, and that you try also to take that long view into your strategic thinking and into your planning. So scenario analysis itself is maybe not making plans, but we hope, of course, that the result of the scenario planning are used in making plans for the future, and at least to be prepared for the unthinkable and things you don't want to see. It's got a very important step in scenario analysis is the definition of the domain of analysis. I already said that based on the discussion we had on the title of this project, where we started with pharmaceutical research and we ended up with medicine and social policy. So the identification of the domain of analysis is a very critical one. If you make it too narrow, then you miss maybe very relevant trends and relevant developments. If you make it too big, then it may be very superficial and it doesn't add to your thinking. So it's always this balancing act where you have to deal with how to identify the domain and stick to that domain, because what is very often seen is that you start with a very narrow domain, and then in the data collection, in the interviews, in the data collection, and also the conversations, you have a very broader picture, and that is very challenging also to come back to the terms of reference where you started. Very important here, and I will come back to that later as well, is that we try to identify a number of important driving forces. What I just showed you was just a picture, more the wallpaper. But in that wallpaper, on that wallpaper, we see also very important drivers. And I will come back to that later, because not every driving force is relevant, and not every driving force is uncertain. And we have to figure out what are the most critical ones, but also what are the most uncertain ones, because that is for the skeleton of the scenario project very, very important. And that means that at the end we end up with one or two scenario drivers, and these are the major dimensions of the skeleton of the project, and the result are 2 to 4 scenarios based on the version impact on these scenario drivers. So just briefly, the key steps. It's also important, and I already mentioned it a little bit, but scenario planning is not about trying to find consensus or the common view, or to say, well, we as a group at university, we feel that it goes that direction. That's more for Delphi. It's also very important, very relevant, but that's not what we want to aim. We wanted to look at the extremes, that the common sense is we go that direction, but there is one individual in the group say, well, I'm not so sure. Have you thought about that? I'm not so sure, because we have seen this 20 years ago, and then it moves in that direction. So we are interested in the uncertainty. So the odds beyond the comfort zone are relevant. So forecasting is very much on try to find some kind of a common view, but that is not the main objective of at least this methodology of scenario analysis. So keep that in mind, because that means also that we were always interested in the unthinkable part, and some of the scenarios we will present and we have presented are not what you would talk about on a birthday party or on a family gathering, etc. That's more on the left part of this picture. So in summary, what I've just said is the key part of the scenario analysis was ranking the driving forces, and there we used these digital tables where we connected across the world, talking about the time zones area. We had to figure out time zones from between Japan and Brazil, vice versa, etc. But we worked and we worked out that, and I think we were very privileged to have all these experts, including yourself, on panel. And what you see here is that when you have done this exercise and make this whole list of rich and poor and mature, and that you stratify according to 2 dimensions, how important is this driving force, and what about uncertainty? And then you end up with this 2x2 table where you say, well, driving forces that are not important and very certain, they are very relevant for the project. We are most interested in 2 blocks, the predetermined elements. So these are important, but they have a high level of certainty. And a good example is always the aging population. We know that is important for almost everything in terms of therapeutics, in terms of drug delivery, in terms of drug application, and drug formulations, etc., etc. But there is not so much uncertainty, where does it go? It will be a heavy burden for almost every society in the world to deal with that. We are very interested in those driving forces that are important but are very uncertain, and we call them the critical uncertainty, because they are, the input for, okay, it could go that direction, but it could also be that direction, and both are feasible, but we don't know where it goes. But we have to think about, let's assume that the world goes in that direction. Where is my lab? Where is my university? Where are patients? Where is, for instance, the development of new formulations, etc.? So that is summarized here in this slide, and we ended up with two big collections of driving forces, and these are summarized here in the next two slides. I started with the predetermined elements, so these are important, but we feel these are not so uncertain, because we feel that the science will continue to deliver. Of course, we all struggle with rising cost of research, and the lab should have more money, etc. But people like yourself, but I see it across the globe, we have a very, very, very rich pharmaceutical sciences society across the globe, and we see outcomes of that, and that will deliver on precision and transformative medicine, blurring boundaries between pharma, artificial intelligence, medtech, new formulations, and so on, and so that will go on. That's a train that maybe goes a little bit slower, a little bit faster, but it goes in a certain direction. But there is also growing concern about the global divide, as already said, in access and affordability. Pharma business model, that's there. It's not uncertain, and almost every society, whether you are in the north or the south or the east or the west, you struggle with that and how to work with for solutions on that. We see that future medicines, and you part of that game, are more complex, that need more monitoring and guidance for use. If you look at for instance, the output of the European Medicines Agency over the last decade, almost 60-70% over the last years, there are precautions for good use in the label that was not there when we had only white tablets. And we see more and more guidance for use are critical to ensure a positive benefit risk. So it's not only the white tablet with 500 milligrams of paracetamol, it's much more with nanotechnology, advanced therapies, etc. So a critical role for clinical practice after approval. And I would like to emphasize, particularly in an academic environment where we're now talking about, that this has also important implications for teaching, for bridging the new technologies also to the teaching, because we can have all these new technologies in practice, but when we don't have the practitioners to work with them, both physicians and pharmacists and the people around that, then we don't serve the individual patients and public health. We see also increased international collaboration, and that will advance. And I'm not so sure whether I would still have that bullet today, because the world has changed the last year very significantly. But we still feel that, in particular in the pharmaceutical science, we see more interconnectivity, we see more open science, and that's something that will go on, and that will have a huge impact also in the way we do our research and the way we translate our research into the clinic. Again, the geopolitical tensions will be there: nationalism, failed states, climate change, impact on science directions and progress. You see more and more also that, and for instance, our university had their anniversary last week, and we had huge discussions about how climate change will also affect the building of new labs, and how sustainable the design of a new laboratory should be to meet the requirements of the new climate conditions, etc. So that's not a discussion we had 10 years ago. Of course, we had somewhere in the back, we had a discussion about climate change, but now it's more real. It's very, very much also affecting the way we work and the way we plan for future research. And then finally, we saw that also in the COVID vaccine and the COVID pandemic, there is a lot of discussions about the trust in science, and the trusted science is also at stake. You see discussions about fake news, of people who believe in vaccines and people who think, oh, this is nothing. And that is something we have to deal with, and how we deal as academics, as scientists, also to work with that. We can't say, well, these people on the street, they are foolish and we don't believe them, and they should believe us, but that's not the solution as such. We should emphasize much more on communication and much more on trust building, but also, and there is always this risk of political capture of science and threatening credibility. That is not only in one country or one region or one political system. We see it across the globe that more and more science and political capture are coming together, with all the risk we see that how can we build science that is serving the public, that is serving society, is serving, in our case, also individuals, patients. So this list, and it's of course not a complete list, but these were the predetermined elements identified by the project team, where we said these are important, but these are not uncertain, because we feel that they will move on and they will affect our future. Then I move on to the more critical uncertainties that we say, well, these are important, but we don't know where the direction is going. We don't know how that will affect our lab or our research or the industry or investors. And just briefly, in summary, there is a lot of discussions about clinical evidence. How much evidence is needed to approve a product? We have these discussions about new oncology products, where some people believe, well, the EMA and the FDA approves products on the basis of very immature data, where other people feel, well, regulators should be faster and more flexible. And that is something where we really don't know which direction we will take, and how regulators will handle this. There's a global discussions about that, and also in the context of will real-world data, real-world evidence also add to randomized clinical trials, and what does that mean? And that is something that is on the top of ICH, and we see it also in the ICMA, where FDA and EMA, but also other agencies and other authorities, have this conversation about how much evidence is enough. And it is not only a regulatory question; it's also a health technology question. You can say, well, the regulators can do their war dance, but when they move their uncertainty to the HTA and reimbursement people, then we have another problem, but that more downstream. That is at the middle of. I know that the Turkish agency has a very good collaboration between the regulatory and the HTA people, but that's not easy. There's a lot of political challenges as well, because the science may say, well, approve this product, but the people who are responsible for the budget may say, well, should we have that on the market? So there's always this tension, and that at the bottom we have the science of clinical evidence building. And that means that the ambiguity about the role of regulators, are they facilitator of innovations, are they gatekeepers, and the question about expedited regulatory pathway, that means expedited, that you are not only rules-based, but also principle-based, that you can say, well, we have new knowledge here and new data and new insight, and there's some evidence that may make us more positive or more negative about the underlying evidence. And that means also that we either approve the product or not approve the product. That's at stake in various platforms at the moment across the globe. But we see also that, and I already mentioned it in the beginning, that we have this broken incentive system. We see virtually nothing in the space of new antibiotics. We see virtually nothing in the space of new psychiatric products. I'm a member of the scientific board of the Dutch Cardiovascular Society, and I push this very much because if you look at where pharma is going, there is very little on cardiovascular disease, and that's very odd, because it's either one or either number two of the mortality reasons why people die, and we see that there is a very big gap here between the needs and where the science and where the innovation is going. We see a lot of discussions about cancer and other high-end medicines, particularly in the orphan space, rare diseases. But will that mean also will that be also the future, or do we see a refocus on more communicable diseases, pandemics, AMR? I must say, in 2021, everybody will say we should move this shift to more pandemic-driven research. When I now look at the Research Council or calls from Brussels or whatever, etc., still somewhere in the bushes there, but it's not as prevalent as it was 2 years ago. So maybe we have already forgotten the pandemic and we are still back to business. And I think that's a real pity, because we should learn from these crises also for the future. We see an increased fragmentation on power of international institutions, WHO, World Bank, and they struggle how to figure out, for instance, exchange of students. If you are a Turkish scientist, is it easy for you to go to China, vice versa? And what does that mean? And that's very difficult at the moment to predict, because I had two PhD students around Christmas, one from China and one from Saudi Arabia. And we had a lot of discussions about, okay, would we start that project at the moment? And I must say, I'm a retired professor now. I'm very pleased that I'm not in the position anymore for policy making or governance, because it is a very difficult time to make right decisions here and also find the right directions. And then to stop here, science policies are moving in various directions. You know, we had very strong top-down versus bottom-up discussions, but also the role of philanthropy. You know, is it right that Bill Gates or Melinda Gates gives a lot of money in certain directions, while the people who are getting the money are very happy? But when you look at it from a more global perspective, these are individuals, private organizations, and where is the public influence of the directions of that philanthropy? I'm very positive about philanthropy, but there are some tensions here also we should acknowledge. And the same is with public, private, and open science. So these are the critical uncertainties that really were teased out of all these conversations we had at the digital tables. And of course, many of these are not new to you, but the way we made synergy between the various ones, that was input also for the scenario project itself. And that means that the scenario drivers were teased out of these critical uncertainties. And scenario drivers means that there are one-dimensional contrasts to portray the plausible and divergent future story. So two drivers allow two-dimensional space. Examples: do we see a science culture in the future that is more vocational or more entrepreneurial? We see both at the moment, but what's the direction? Societal trust in technology, is it high or low? And where is it high and where is it low? We see in the past we had very often surveys or all kinds of other data collections where we saw, well, it's high, but it's not always high in one on a societal level, but you see very often that it is high in certain societal groups, but in other groups it is not high. And what does that mean? The level of public control, is that strict or is it more relaxed and market-driven? And these are examples. In this project, we selected two. One was the disease approach, where we felt, okay, is it still there that we invest most of the money in cell biology, immunology, cancer research, rare diseases, or do we move more to a more public health, AMR, pandemic prevention approach, that dimension? And the second was the level of global convergence. Is that high or is that low? And where does it go? And of course, this is of course very high level, but I hope that I can convince you that at the moment you try to build these two dimensions in your head, you see pictures, you see stories, you see certain stories about, okay, the world could look like that, and it's still feasible, and still the scenarios that come out that are different. And what does that mean? Just to highlight two supportive elements for the choice of the scenario drivers. And the first is this picture, and this is from the EMA annual report 2020. They changed a little bit this classification in the 2021 report, so I didn't use that. But what you see here is the stratification according to a therapeutic area, where companies or academic groups go to EMA and say, well, we are developing a new product for Parkinson's disease, and we struggle with trial design or the endpoint or whatever, or the formulation and so on. So what you see here actually is a pre-screen of the future, because when it's not here, it's probably never reached the patient, because actually this is 5 to 10 years, maybe 15 years before the product will come on the market. And of course, not everything will be successful. So what you see here is where pharma is going. And it's only a stratification on therapeutic. I could have other stratifications about technology, about formulation, etc. But just on therapy. And what you see here, that the second, so that's the cancer research, is on top of everything. And what you see also is that in other areas, for instance, central nervous system is not too small, but it's 90% neurology and only 10% psychiatry. When you look at infections, it's virtually everything is viral and virtually nothing is bacterial. So this is a very skewed picture. So the top is cancer and rare diseases, etc. And that's good news for these patients. But the question is, of course, is that sustainable or not? And that is also the underlying concept of the scenario driver on disease approach. Will this picture will that also be the future, or do we see a reshape or a redistribution, more to public health, more to infections, more to pandemic, etc.? Actually, I don't have the answer, but it's a relevant question to think about, because we see also more and more reports and signals that all the investments in cancer research have not always delivered on a population basis. Of course, we all know individual patients that has really benefited from all this, but it's not always reflected on a population basis. And that makes policymakers and decision makers very nervous, because the billions of dollars or euros that goes into this, well, where should they deliver? And that voice came not only from the pharma activists in the digital tables, particularly the investor said, well, this is not sustainable anymore, because if you now see that, for instance, Pfizer just bought a product for, I think it was $30 billion. Well, I hope they get some money out of that, but then I hope that the patients are benefiting from it. But these are huge amounts of money, and at the end of the day also reflected in high prices, and not everybody can pay for that. And even within Europe, and I'm sure also you have the discussions in Turkey, we have the product there, it's approved, but it's not accessible for the majority of the population, with a lot of concerns also in the political arena. The second is very much, and I already mentioned that, so I can be very brief on that, is this whole globalization, because virtually all of us have international collaborations. We travel, we meet other scientists, and for many years it was virtually without a lot of boundaries, etc. And the world is changing on that with various directions. And this was a report in New York Times of last year, but it's globalization is over, and the global culture wars, and people who don't talk to each other, and people who hate each other for political reasons, etc. This is very bad for science and for pharmaceutical sciences in particular, and that is something we don't know where it goes. And we are right in the middle as we have this conversation. We see that the world outside there is getting more and more complex and more also difficult to handle, with a lot of impact, of course, also for the future of medicines research. So the results, and then I wrap up. The future of medicines of social policy resulted in 4 different scenarios and depicted in this two-dimensional space, where global convergence at the top is very high and at the bottom very low, where the disease approach at the right is very much transformative, cancer, high-end, rare diseases, very much science-driven translation of the most recent technology into pharmaceutics. And at the left is much more, more sustainable, more green, more, not everything is what is possible should be done. And in particular, the deprioritizing the high end is a scenario where we really sketch a feasible future where investments and also trust in the future of cancer research has reached a tipping point, and where there is a big change in other directions, where we see transformative healing, the other picture, where we see almost everything that is possible is also translated into the clinic at the expense of equal access. So there's always a winner and a loser. There is never that everybody will benefit. There is always this trade-off and this balancing act. And we try to be as balanced as possible in the paper to show that, not to put our political hat on, but to show, whatever direction you go, there is a payoff, either in the positive sense or a negative sense, and we should acknowledge that. I think the most negative scenario in this picture is the global divide, where we see a lot of turmoil, a lot of restrictions to exchange, a lot of restrictions also to collaborate. And that means that there are some winners, and we highlight particularly the role of countries in the Far East, but also in some countries in Africa and in South America. But when we look at Europe, the Middle East, etc., we don't see there a very bright future when it comes to this, and there's a lot of negative sentiment also around the outcomes. This is also summarized here in keywords: deprioritizing the high end, decline, frustration, priority for primary care, repurposing, practice innovation. So it's a big change, and when we presented it to patients with cancer, of course, they didn't like this at all, because they said, well, I don't trust this. But during the conversation, we said, well, it's feasible. What does that mean? We have also noticed that for a lot of people, particularly students, etc., they really like the sustainable flow because it affects very much also openness, citizen science, IP sharing, ethical philanthropy, etc., etc. But there is, of course, also a price. It's not only green and beautiful, that it's also something we have to acknowledge, in particular when it comes to the level of innovation that will go down in the sustainable flow. And so people will say, well, I take that price and I will pay for that price, because at the end of the day, the benefit risk of that scenario is much more positive. We see the transformative healing, that's the blue scenario. Everything that is possible comes out of it. It's competitive, high-end focus, push focus, regulatory flexibility. So the regulators are enablers, they are not restrictions. And it's the global health need that's not a priority. It's who is willing and able to pay will get the new innovation. And it's more a tech heaven and highly specialized. And I mentioned already the global divide. So Aram, I would like to stop here, and of course I'm very open to discussions, but maybe to appetize the discussion a little bit. Do you see a preferable scenario for yourself, and why, and what will be the most likely scenario and why? But we have maybe only a few minutes to reflect that. But having said that, I thank you for your attention. It was fun to talk to you, although on a distance. But very much appreciated. Thank you very much.